What happens when an army general's son thinks he's untouchable until his own father stands up in court and chooses justice over him? What happens when an army general's son decides that his father's 4 stars make him untouchable and slaps an 80-year-old Korean War veteran to the ground outside a Veterans Affairs office in broad daylight? This arrogant young man walked into my courtroom believing his father's rank and reputation would dissolve every consequence before it could ever reach him. But when I forced that general to choose between protecting his son and honoring everything his uniform stands for, what happened next became the moment that reminded an entire country what the word service actually means. The defendant stood there, looking at me like this courtroom was an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted time for. And he said in front of that injured veteran, in front of every person in that gallery, "Do you know who my father is? He commands armies. This old man is nobody." The room went completely still. But what nobody in that courtroom knew, what even he didn't know, was that General Thomas Caldwell was sitting in the back row in full dress uniform. Every medal and decoration earned across 40 years of service, arranged in precise rows across his chest, watching his son destroy the meaning of every single one of them. And the decision he was about to make would break hearts, restore faith in justice, and prove that real honor cannot be inherited, only demonstrated. Before we dive into this story, Kawaii, less than 5% of you watching are actually subscribed. If you believe in real justice, in honoring the men and women who actually served this country, and in holding the privileged accountable, regardless of rank or family name, hit that subscribe button right now. This story is going to spread everywhere, and you do not want to miss what happens next. It was a crisp Wednesday morning, and I was preparing for what appeared to be a straightforward assault case. At my age, I have presided over thousands of cases, but something about this one felt different the moment that file landed on my desk. The victim was Arthur Bennett, 80 years old, Korean War veteran, a man who had given this country his youth and asked for very little in return. The defendant was 30-year-old Ethan Caldwell, son of General Thomas Caldwell, one of the most decorated 4-star generals in the history of the United States Army. To understand what happened inside that courtroom, you first need to understand what happened on those steps 5 days before. The case file told a story that made me set down my coffee and not pick it up again. Arthur Bennett had been to that VA office dozens of times over the years. It was routine for him, a man who had spent a lifetime treating obligation as something you show up for, regardless of how your hip feels or how slowly the morning is moving. He arrived that Wednesday the way he always did, deliberately, quietly, with his cane and his veteran's cap and the unhurried dignity of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He was moving through the revolving door when Ethan Caldwell came up behind him. Ethan was late, not for anything urgent, not for anything that would justify what came next, under any reading of any standard of human decency, but late in the way that men who have never been made to wait for anything experience lateness as an affront. He told Bennett to move faster. Bennett, according to 3 separate witnesses who gave nearly identical accounts, turned slightly, apologized, and continued at his pace. The only pace available to an 80-year-old man with a twice-replaced hip navigating a revolving door with a cane. That was enough for Ethan Caldwell. He shoved past him with both hands. Not a brush, not an impatient nudge, but a deliberate, forceful shove that sent Arthur Bennett's cane skittering across the concrete and took his legs out from under him. Bennett hit the steps hard, his hip fractured on impact, his shoulder dislocated as he tried to break the fall. The laceration above his eye came from the edge of the step. He lay there on the concrete outside the building, that exists specifically to serve men like him, and he did not cry out. Witnesses said he made almost no sound at all. Ethan Caldwell looked down at him. He straightened his jacket. That detail appears in all 3 witness statements, the straightening of the jacket. And he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Do you know who my father is? He commands armies. This old man is nobody." Then he walked inside. A bystander standing 10 feet away had been recording for 17 seconds before the shove. The phone captured everything: the shove, the fall, the jacket, the words in sharp, unambiguous, undeniable detail. Arthur Bennett spent 5 days in the hospital, and by the time he was discharged, what happened to him on those steps had reached every corner of the country. The footage was online before the ambulance reached the hospital. Someone had posted it within minutes. No caption, no commentary, just 17 seconds of video that needed neither. By midnight, 12 million people had watched an 80-year-old Korean War veteran hit concrete steps outside a Veterans Affairs office, while the man who put him there straightened his jacket and walked inside. The reaction that followed was unlike anything I had seen attach itself to a case before it reached my courtroom. It was not simply outrage, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper and more specific. Veterans organizations began releasing statements within hours, and what struck me reading them was not the anger, but the grief. Active duty service members, retired officers, Gold Star families, military spouses. The language they used almost uniformly was the language of mourning, as if something had been struck that went far beyond one elderly man on a set of concrete steps, as if the footage had made visible the particular devastation of watching a generation sacrifice be dismissed as nobody by someone who has never once been asked to sacrifice anything at all. General Thomas Caldwell's name was trending nationally before dawn. His public affairs office issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern for Mr. Bennett and confidence in the justice system. It was read approximately 3 million times and satisfied almost none of them. The district attorney announced charges before noon. The speed of that announcement told you everything about the pressure bearing down on every office connected to this case. By the morning of trial, my courtroom was the most heavily attended I had presided over in 30 years on this bench. Veterans sat in uniform in the gallery. Gold Star family members had driven hours to be present. Journalists filled every press seat and lined the walls, and over everything hung the particular stillness of people who have come not to watch a spectacle, but to bear witness to something that matters. I called the court to order and felt the weight of every person in that room settle onto the proceedings like a hand on a shoulder. Then the doors opened, and Ethan Caldwell walked in, and whatever remaining uncertainty I had about the character of this case dissolved instantly. I have presided over this courtroom long enough to know that how a defendant walks through that door tells you almost everything before the proceeding begins. Ethan walked in dressed in a charcoal suit, fitted and precise, with the kind of military straight posture that comes not from service but from growing up around it, the inherited bearing of a man who has absorbed the aesthetic of discipline without ever being subject to its demands. His expression was one of curated indifference, carefully constructed and carefully maintained the look of someone who has decided that performing calm under pressure is the same thing as actually possessing it. He was accompanied by 4 attorneys. I noted that 2 of them carried themselves with this specific bearing of men who had military service in their backgrounds. Whether that was coincidence or strategy, I did not find it reassuring either way. And then he passed Arthur Bennett. Bennett was sitting in the gallery, his Korean War veteran cap on his head, his hip in a brace that made sitting visibly uncomfortable. the faint remnant of the laceration still visible above his eye. He sat with the straight-backed quietude of a man who has long since learned that dignity is not something circumstances can take from you unless you surrender it yourself. Ethan Caldwell passed within 4 feet of him and did not glance in his direction. Not a flicker of recognition, not a moment's pause, not the smallest acknowledgement that the man sitting there in a hip brace was the man he had left on a set of concrete steps. He passed him the way you pass furniture. I watched all of it from the bench. I have a practice of keeping my glasses on until the proceedings require otherwise. By the time Ethan Caldwell reached the defense table and pulled out his chair, my glasses were already off. What happened next removed any remaining ambiguity about what kind of morning this was going to be. I called the case and asked Ethan Caldwell how he wished to plead. His lead attorney was on his feet immediately, and I let him speak his 2 sentences of preamble before I cut him off. Counselor, I am asking your client, Mr. Caldwell, and how do you plead? Ethan straightened in his chair, looked at me with those carefully composed eyes, and said, "Not guilty, Your Honor. Frankly, I think this charge is a significant overreaction to what was a very minor incident. A significant overreaction." I set my pen down and let that phrase sit in the air of the courtroom for a moment because I wanted every person in that gallery to hear it fully before I responded to it. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, "a man spent 5 days in a hospital. His hip is fractured. His shoulder was dislocated. Would you like to walk me through your definition of a significant overreaction? Or shall we continue?" He continued. He described Arthur Bennett as a confused old man who was blocking the entrance and characterized what he had done as incidental contact that unfortunately resulted in a fall. The gallery, which had been holding itself in rigid, controlled silence, shifted in a way I could feel from the bench. A collective tightening, a fury so compressed it had nowhere to go. I came down from the bench. I walked past the defense table, past the bar, and into the gallery, and I stopped directly in front of Arthur Bennett. "Mr. Bennett, would you please stand?" He stood. It took him a moment. The hip brace made it slow, and he needed his cane. And he did it the way he did everything, without complaint, without performance, with the full, unhurried dignity of a man who survived a war at 19 years old and has been standing back up ever since. I turned to face Ethan Caldwell. The courtroom was completely silent. "Look at this man," I said. "Look at him carefully, and then tell me again that he was nobody." Ethan Caldwell looked. The gallery waited, and his expression did not change. Not a flicker, not a crack, not a single moment of recognition or remorse. His arrogance in that instant was so complete and so chilling that several people in the gallery looked away from him rather than from Bennett. That told me everything I needed to know about what this case was going to require. And that was precisely when his attorney decided it was time to play the card he had been holding since the trial began. Brandon's lead attorney rose with the practiced ease of a man who has spent a career making uncomfortable facts sound like reasonable questions. He began methodically. The angle of the bystanders' footage created a misleading impression of force. He suggested the concrete steps presented an inherent instability risk for elderly individuals with mobility limitations. Mr. Bennett's own medical history was relevant context for understanding how minimal contact could result in a disproportionate outcome. Each point was delivered not as an argument so much as a suggestion, the legal equivalent of opening a window and letting doubt drift in on its own. And then, with the seamless transition of someone who had been building toward it from the first sentence, he mentioned General Thomas Caldwell, not as a threat, as context, as a gentle reminder of the family into which this case had inserted itself, the 40 years of decorated service, the institutional weight of the Caldwell name, the particular complexity of prosecuting the son of a man who had given so much to the very countries whose justice system was now arrayed against his child. The implication moved through the gallery like smoke through a closed room, slow, pervasive, impossible to point to directly. I watched it reach the veterans sitting in their uniforms, and I watched their jaws tighten. I watched it reach the Gold Star families, and I watched them look at their hands. Ethan straightened in his chair. Something shifted in his expression, the first loosening of tension I had seen in him since he walked through those doors, the relief of a man who believes the cavalry has just arrived. I let the attorney finish every sentence. I gave him the full conclusion of every point, and then I set down my pen, folded my hands on the bench, and looked past him to the gallery. "General Caldwell," I said, "is he in this courtroom today? What happened next is something I will never forget for as long as I preside over any courtroom." The silence that followed my question lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. From the 5th row of the gallery, a figure rose, full dress uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder, every decoration and commendation earned across 40 years of active service, combat ribbons, distinguished service medals, honors from 3 different administrations, arranged in precise, gleaming rows across his chest. He stood at attention with the particular stillness of a man for whom bearing is not performance, but habit, and the courtroom did not make a sound. Ethan turned in his chair, and the relief drained from his face so completely and so rapidly that what replaced it looked almost like a different person sitting in that chair. General Caldwell walked to the front of the courtroom without being directed. He stood before my bench with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for several days and has finally arrived at the place where he can set it down. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, without any of the measured diplomatic distance that had characterized every public statement his office had released since the footage appeared. He said that his son had struck a Korean War veteran outside a building that exists specifically to honor men like Arthur Bennett. He said there was no angle, no context, no legal reframing, and no consideration of family name or military rank that changed what was visible in that footage or what it meant. Then he turned to face Arthur Bennett. He came to attention sharply, formally, completely, and rendered a salute. A 4-star general in full dress uniform, delivering a formal military salute to an 80-year-old man in a veteran's cap and a hip brace. Bennett received it with a stillness that was more eloquent than anything words could have managed. Then General Caldwell faced me. "Your Honor, do not soften this sentence on my account. My son will face every consequence this court provides. That is my order to him and my promise to you." The courtroom did not erupt. It did something rarer and more human than that. It wept. And with the last shield finally down, it was time for this court to do what it came here to do.